Okay, so we all think we know the story of 1776, right? You've got the heroic patriots, the Declaration of Independence, the birth of a nation, all that good stuff. But here's the thing. That victory was never, ever a sure thing. In fact, it was incredibly fragile. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into a wild what-if. A world where the rebellion got crushed and America stayed British.
And look at this. This right here just shatters the whole myth of a united colonial front. This is based on John Adams' own assessment. And what does it show? Only about a third of the colonists were actually committed patriots. You had an equal number who were hardcore loyalists to the king, and then the biggest slice of the pie, people who were just neutral, kind of waiting to see which way the wind blow. So yeah, victory was anything but guaranteed.
So that leads us to the big question, the one that frames this whole journey. What if that small, fragile group of patriots had been defeated? What would North America, and honestly, the whole world, look like today? Because the consequences, man, they would have cascaded through history in ways you probably wouldn't even expect.
All right, so to really get our heads around what might have been, we first have to appreciate just how unbelievably close the real revolution came to completely falling apart. Before we can build this alternate timeline, we have to look at the cracks in the foundation of the real one. It wasn't just one single event, it was a whole series of moments where history could have gone in a totally different direction.
And where does it all start? Well, like a lot of things, it starts with money. After that super expensive 7 Years' War, which, the colonists called the French and Indian War, Britain was drowning in debt. We're talking a staggering amount. And to pay it down, Parliament looked across the ocean and said, hey, let's tax the colonies. So you get the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and suddenly this long period of salutary neglect where they kind of left the colonies alone was over. And that is what lit the fuse of rebellion. And this timeline right here really drives home how precarious the whole thing was. I mean, look at 1776. Washington's army was almost completely destroyed in New York. Game over right there. A year later, if the colonists lose at Saratoga, forget it. France never would have jumped in, and without their money and their military, there's no way the rebels survive. And then Yorktown. Without the French Navy blockading the coast, that final decisive victory, it just doesn't happen. You change any single one of these moments, and the revolution is toast.
Okay, so now let's flip the script. Imagine the British do win. What happens the very next day? Well, the Crown would immediately start reshaping its colonies. And they wouldn't just go back to the way things were. No, this would be a total reimagining of North America's future, a policy you could call imperial reconstruction.
And in this alternate history, the men we know as the Founding Fathers, well, their fate would be grim. Instead of becoming presidents and statesmen, guys like Washington, Jefferson, and Adams would be tried for treason. The most radical ones, they'd likely be executed or exiled. Their names wouldn't be remembered as heroes, they'd be disgraced rebels. And taking their place, a brand new elite of British-backed loyalists ready to run the show.
And economically? Oh, independence would be completely off the table. The colonies would stay locked into Britain's mercantilist system. So what does that mean? It means their entire economic purpose is just to make the mother country richer. All the valuable goods, all the trade, all the shipping, every last bit of it would be controlled by and for the benefit of London, period.
And this really shows you how that system would have trickled down and shaped everyday life. That whole dream of expanding westward? Dead. Britain would enforce the proclamation of 1763 to stop any more costly wars on the frontier. All that colonial wealth, tobacco from the South, timber from New England, would get funneled right through British ports. And sure, maybe you'd still have local assemblies, but they'd have no real power. Their decisions would always be overruled by Parliament.
All right, let's fast forward a few decades. It's really easy to just assume that a British-controlled America would have just stagnated, right? But that's not necessarily true. Progress would have definitely come, but it would have looked very, very different as the continent moved through the 19th century as, well, British North America.
And here's one of the most profound and honestly challenging differences. A British victory might have meant the end of slavery, maybe decades earlier. And this is the crucial part, without a horrific civil war. The colonies would have just followed the timeline of the rest of the British Empire, which banned the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in 1833. So emancipation would have come from an imperial decree out of London, not from a bloody, devastating internal conflict. The whole path to self-government would be totally transformed too. Instead of that violent, messy break we see in our timeline, the colonies would have probably followed the Canadian model. It'd be a slow, steady, and pretty peaceful evolution. a process of gradual reform leading to what they called responsible government, where local leaders are picked from the elected assembly, and then eventually to dominion status, a self-governing nation, but still within the British Empire.
And this point really nails the nature of progress in this alternate world. The Industrial Revolution? Oh, it would still show up. You'd still see factories and mills popping up in cities like Boston and Philadelphia. But it would all be driven by British money, using British machines, and plugged right into the British market. So progress would be real for sure, but it would just reinforce that colonial dependency instead of building true independence.
But here's the thing. The consequences wouldn't just stop at America's shores. Not even close. A failed revolution would have sent massive ripples across the entire globe, radically altering the course of world history. Just look at this number, 1.3 billion livres. That's the massive debt France racked up helping the American patriots win their war. This debt basically pushed the French monarchy to the edge of bankruptcy, and it was a direct trigger for the French Revolution in 1789. So, think about it. Without a successful American war to pour money into, France's own revolution might have been delayed, maybe it would have been way less radical, or maybe it never would have happened at all.
And you can see the incredible domino effect right here. Napoleon? He'd be facing a much, much stronger Britain, one that's flush with cash and can pull resources and even soldiers from North America. And that whole idea of America as a beacon of liberty, the one that inspired Latin American revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar, it would be snuffed out before it even got started. Their independence movements would be delayed, changing their entire history. And meanwhile, with no rebellious colonies to deal with, Britain could point its full imperial power outward, maybe even accelerating its colonization of Asia and Africa. The whole world map changes. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. What this whole alternate history really forces us to think about are the two very different ways you can get to liberty and self-government. Do you go through the violent fire of revolution, or do you take the slow, patient road of reform?
This table really lays out the two worlds in a final, stark comparison. In our world, you get a republic, born from a violent revolution, a path that, yes, led to a brutal civil war, but also created this global beacon for republicanism. In the alternate world, you get a constitutional monarchy, a dominion that got its freedom through gradual reform. It avoided a civil war, but it stayed a loyal and, you could argue, maybe a less influential piece of a global empire.
And this quote from our source material just captures the heart of this alternate history perfectly. Liberty would not have vanished, only worn the patient mask of reform instead of revolt. The ideals of freedom and self-government, they wouldn't have just disappeared. They just would have taken a totally different path, one that was slower, more cautious, and happened within the empire, not by blowing it all up. And that leaves us with one last really provocative question to chew on. One path gave us the United States as we know it, with all its incredible triumphs and its terrible tragedies like the Civil War. The other path might have offered a more stable, less bloody history, but maybe at the cost of that revolutionary spark. So which one actually creates a better world? The explosive birth of a brand new idea, or the steady evolution within an old one? That's definitely something to think about.